Truth Wins Out executive director released his new book, Lies with a Straight Face, exposing the cranks and cons inside the Xgay industry. It comes at a pivotal moment when the religious right is rebooting the destructive Xgay message. Today, we present an in-depth conversation with Wayne about Lies with a Straight Face. You discuss your personal experience growing up in Texas and the enormous pressure you experienced as an athlete to be heterosexual.
In high school, I was the captain of the basketball team, and there was a lot of pressure to have a girlfriend and live the heterosexual dream. A couple cheerleaders were interested, so it was a real difficult way to dance around that and say things like, oh, I can't go out with you. I'm so busy. I've got too much homework, or I'm so tired from basketball. Incredibly stressful. And that is why it's important to come out of the closet. I didn't think I could at the time, back in the late 80s in high school, but we should create an environment where young people can be who they are and don't have to play these ridiculous, unnecessary games and these obstacles of idiocy that do nothing but stress people out and don't make them heterosexual.
What first got you interested in fighting for LGBTQ equality?
I used to sneak into the gay bar when I was 18, and I had a lot of time to kill because I got there before the bouncers because I wasn't old enough to get in. And as I was killing time, I would read the gay and lesbian newspapers, and I would say, wow, we are really discriminated against. We can get fired for our jobs from being LGBTQ. We can be victims of hate crimes and the police don't do anything. Sodomy laws, we weren't even allowed to have sex. It was illegal. And I was inspired and said, I need to do something about this. I need to change what is happening right now. And that is my introduction to LGBTQ activism. It was the need and desire to do something to make life better for those who came after me.
How did you specifically become interested in fighting Xgay conversion organizations?
I had never heard of Xgay organizations, and I became interested in them because I came out to my parents when I was 18. And we were walking in a mall, and in a bookstore, my mom saw this tape, and her face lit up. And she ran over there with my father and took it off the shelf. It was called Gay and Unhappy, and it was a very strange tape. Half of it was subliminal, and it had this really weird music. It was kind of like an anti-gay Enya. And the other half had a deep voice that said, you love women, you love breasts, you love touching them, you love the way women smell. It was nonsense. And I listened to it, and then I told my parents that basically this tape blamed them for turning me gay, and then suddenly they knew that it was nonsense as well. I felt that these organizations took advantage of my parents at their most desperate and vulnerable point, and they pickpocketed them. They reached into my father's wallet, took his credit card, and ripped them off. And also harmed my family, affected my coming out process. And I wanted to do something about it to make sure nobody ever had to deal with that again. And at least they had the facts. Fortunately, my parents came around rather quickly and accepted me for who I was and acknowledged the idiocy of this Xgay tape and the Xgay industry. Other people come from much more religious households. They don't have it so lucky. And they're taken to Xgay boot camps, or they're forced into ministries, or given exorcisms, and in extreme cases, physical therapy such as shock therapy or aversion therapy. The battle continues today. And I want to create a record like a prosecutor, going after these groups, exposing them one by one, shutting them down one by one, so the next generation does not have to suffer like ours did.
What was the first time you met someone who identified as Xgay?
I remember the first time I met somebody who was part of Exodus International and identified as Xgay. There was an anti-gay speaker on campus at University of Florida named Paul Cameron. And there was one side of anti-gay activists and one side of pro-LGBTQ people. And it was it was very tense. And one of the people on the anti-gay side was a young man, pretty good looking, running around screaming, I have changed. I have found freedom. It's possible. I have found the Lord. It turns out that I found out a few weeks later that he was sleeping with people in the dorms and then blackmailing them, that if he was outed, he would out them. So I had a very bad impression of my first Xgay and Xgay ministries.
You wrote Anything But Straight in 2003. What made you write a sequel 20 years later?
I wrote Anything But Straight to talk about the history of conversion therapy from the 1950s to 2003. And 20 years went by, and an amazing amount of things happened. Virtually every major ex-gay leader and ex-gay organization shut down. We look at Exodus International, which was the biggest conversion therapy organization in the world. They shut down after their leader said it didn't work. And I can go on and on with examples like this, where the people I used to fight against in green rooms and debate against on television and radio shows, I now talk to them and they're out of the closet. Some are married to same-sex partners. So I had to update the world on what had happened from 2003 to the present. And I wanted to make sure the truth was written down for posterity. So 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 500 years from now, people could look back on this time period and say, what happened with conversion therapy and ex-gay organizations? Did they work? And the answer is they're a complete fraud that built people of their money. And I think my book outlines that history and does so as a warning to not try these organizations. There is nothing good that will come out of it.
In the book you debunk the Xgay talking point that the Xgay industry is only there for those who want to change.
I made a point in my book of addressing the ex-gay propaganda that, our ministries are only there for people who want to change. But why do they want to change? That is the question you must ask. And by the time somebody gets to a conversion therapist or an ex-gay program, it's because they were told they weren't good enough. They were told they were inferior, that they had to be somebody that they are not, and they are beaten down, and they are browbeaten, and they are bullied. And so when they say, because we're here for you because you want to change, yeah, of course they want to change because they're told they're going to hell. They're told they're going to lose their family. They're told they're going to not have their school paid for. All these really traumatic consequences. So it's not really a choice in the way the ex-gay ministries are presenting it. It's more coercion than anything.
In Lies with a Straight Face you mention the rampant misogyny in ex-gay programs.
You can't separate misogyny from ex-gay ministries because they come from the same root faith. People have to understand that ex-gay programs are religious fundamentalism. It's a faith healing program. And if you buy into it, you also have to buy into all the other noxious tenets of that faith tradition, such as women are inferior and they're there to serve men. And that is why ex-gay programs are so misogynistic, because they're rooted in fundamentalism and faith healing. And the Southern Baptist tenet that a man should control a woman and a woman should graciously submit to her husband.
One interesting point you make is that our culture forces gay youth into situations against their will. You call it a form of abuse. Elaborate on your theory.
Our culture thinks it's okay to tell a young gay kid to go experiment with the opposite sex, even though they know they're gay, and they have no interest at all. And they would never think of doing that for heterosexual. They never tell a straight young man or woman, why don't you go experiment with your same-sex friend? You might enjoy it. Don't make a decision yet. But our society has no problem forcing LGBTQ people into those situations. And that can be incredibly harmful. In essence, it's a society forcing them to have sex against their will with somebody they're not attractive to. That can be something that scars them for a lifetime. I mean, there are much worse things in the world. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to overblow this or overplay this. But it is something that society can do without. We don't need to do that. Young LGBTQ people know who they are. They don't need to be forced into situations that they are uncomfortable with or find unappealing or in some cases disgusting, just to appease adults who are upset that they might have a gay or lesbian, bisexual, or transgender child.
In your book you talk about the different kinds of ex-gay programs. You go into detail about how all LGBTQ people are harmed by ex-gay programs even if they never enter a conversion program. What do you mean by this?
Only a percentage of LGBTQ people go through an official ex-gay ministry or program. However, almost all LGBTQ people who grow up in an atmosphere where they feel pressured to be heterosexual try to change, and they do it themselves. For example, they'll look at opposite sex porn and try to pretend that they enjoy it when in fact they know they don't? And are they deny themselves the pleasure and the romanticism with someone they actually want to be with and date the opposite sex? So a lot of LGBTQ people put themselves through an Xgay program without it being an official Xgay ministry. And it has the same effect. It can scar your mental health and stunt your psychosexual growth.
What was the significance of the Truth in Love campaign, and why was it so historic?
The 1998 Truth in Love campaign was significant because it was the first time the right wing went all in to say that they could change gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people into heterosexuals. And they had this very expensive ad campaign with ads all over the country. For example, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and television commercials featuring ex-gays. And they were so confident with this campaign that they called it the Normandy landing in the cultural wars. So if this campaign worked, they would be able to thwart gay rights legislation and say, well, you don't need legislation to protect you from being fired from your job. You just have to change. You don't need protection from hate crimes. You can change. You don't need marriage equality. You can change. That's what the purpose of this campaign was and why it was so important to prove that it was a fraud. And that's what I set out to do. And I think the results have been pretty impressive. Almost every ex-gay leader involved in that campaign I've exposed as a fraud and somebody who isn't who they said they were.
While you were at the Human Rights Campaign, you photographed ex-gay spokesperson John Polk in a gay bar. Take us back to that scene.
In 1998, the religious right launched the Truth in Love campaign and put ex-gay advertisements across the country. And the biggest star of this campaign was John Polk. He appeared with his wife Ann on the cover of Newsweek. He had been on Oprah, 60 Minutes, 2020. Everybody in America had heard John Polk's story of transformation from gay to straight. So imagine my surprise when I got a call from Daryl Hershaft, my colleague at the Human Rights Campaign, where I worked at the time. And he said, get down to the bar, Mr. Peace, right now. John Polk, the king of the ex-gay ministries, is in the bar and hitting on me. So I ran down as fast as I could. I almost got run over by a taxi. And I slowly approached the creaky paint chip door. And I slowly opened it, very nervous, because this would be huge to expose the biggest ex-gay in the world. And I opened it, and by God, there he was, John Polk, his lie about to be exposed. And I crept up to him very slowly. And then he looked up. And all bedlam, all hell broke loose. And I held up my camera, one of those old-fashioned cameras you used to buy at the drugstore and click. And I said, John Polk, is that you? And clicked it. And you should have seen his eyes. And he was stunned that he had been busted. And then he tried to take my camera from me. And I pushed him into a cigarette machine. And then he left the bar and I followed him out. And I said, John, how do you live with yourself going to a gay bar after going to an anti-gay conference? How many young people have you harmed with this hypocritical, pathetic behavior? He didn't answer me, obviously, but he did admit the next day that he was at Mr. P's. First he said, I was just going to the bathroom. And then he said, I thought it was a straight bar. There were men and women in there. Well, the only women in there were in drag, so there were no actual women in there. It was the biggest scandal of its time, and people still talk about it today. And it's an emblem how ex-gay ministries don't work and how they are fraudulent. And those who claim very loudly that they have changed really haven't.
You have described your work as being like a prosecutor in court. Explain what you mean.
I see myself as a prosecutor in essence, prosecuting a case against ex-gay ministries and conversion therapy. We need to lay the foundation to fight back. So 5 years from now, 50 years from now, we have a case that people can go to. So when they go and Google on the internet and does a search on conversion therapy and ex-gay ministries and wonders if they should put their child in such programs. And we have produced such an enormous amount of compelling evidence that they choose not to and say, I don't think this is a good idea. I think this is going to harm my child. And that is what Truth Wins Out and my work is about.
More than anyone, you have exposed ex-gay leaders as frauds. What major scandal that you broke was underappreciated?
The one scandal that I broke that was underappreciated was the Michael Johnston scandal. It was before the internet was huge and there was social media. And we caught Johnston, who was a star of the Truth in Love campaign, in motel room orgies. I mean, this was a big scandal because this was Jerry Falwell's personal ex-gay leader. He was the founder of National Coming Out of Homosexuality Day. He also worked with the American Family Association and appeared in videos such as It's Not Gay. So this was the refutation of everything in the ex-gay industry. It got some press attention and it broke in the Southern Voice newspaper, but it should have gotten a lot more because everybody in America had heard his story, but they also should have known how he failed and wasn't a success story like he claimed to be.
There are critics that have disagreed with these tactics and called them outing. Do you consider it outing, and what do you have to say to these critics?
I've had a few critics like Lily Tomlin that don't like when I expose ex-gay leaders. They call it outing. And I don't believe this is outing. Outing is when you go after a private citizen and expose their secret life. But when you're an ex-gay leader and you claim, I'm living proof I can change, well, you're more than just a person, you're a theory. And the theory is that gay people can pray away the gay, that they can very willy-nilly go back and forth between gay and straight. And when you do that and you say, I'm living proof, then you can be disproved. And that is what I do. I disprove the theory that you can change. I disprove the theory that you can pray away the gay. And you also cannot claim that it's none of your business when it's actually your business and how you pay your bills and make your money. And finally, you cannot separate the message from the damage they're doing, particularly the LGBTQ youth. If you know you can stop it, how can't you stop it? How do you justify not stopping and allowing the abuse to continue? It seems unconscionable to me to do so. And that's why I don't consider it outing. I consider it public service.
You wrote that you started Truth Wins Out in 2006 after President George W. Bush invited ex-gay leaders from Exodus International to the White House. Take us back to this time.
A lot of people see the ex-gay ministries as a joke today because so many of their leaders have been scandalized or come out of the closet. But we have to remember they were a political force in 2006. So much so that President George W. Bush invited them to the White House. And the reason they were at the White House was to stump in favor of the federal marriage amendment, which would have made marriage illegal for gay people in the Constitution. And their message was very offensive and very clear. It was, oh, gay people don't need to marry, they just need to change. That's the answer. And at that moment, I decided to start Truth Wins Out. If ex-gay leaders were powerful enough and influential enough to be in the White House, in the Rose Garden, with a president of the United States, somebody had to start monitoring and exposing them on a daily basis. And that's when I started Truth Wins Out in 2006.
The ex-gay industry collapsed with the closing of Exodus International. What do you attribute to the fall of the ex-gay myth?
The ex-gay industry collapsed with the fall of Exodus International. And I attribute this to the fact it was built on a foundation of lies. And they kept changing the story and changing the definition of the word change. They kept making up statistics that didn't exist. And eventually it caught up with them. And they could no longer maintain the fiction. And the facts had to emerge.
Do you forgive the ex-gay leaders you interviewed?
I've never seen it as my job to forgive ex-gay leaders. I'm not the Pope. I'm not their preacher. I am somebody who has the job of making sure people don't follow in their footsteps. People who have been through ex-gay ministry, survivors who have been harmed, it's up to them on whether or not to forgive. What I do, though, is I use the stories of those who have been ex-gay leaders to ensure that people don't follow in their footsteps and take that destructive path. In that sense, I believe it's important in our role to tell their stories, to get their message out there that I was the one who wrote the books on whether you can change. And I'm telling you, as the person who wrote the book, it doesn't work.
In Lies with a Straight Face, you outline how this insidious movement has gone international.
People often think of the ex-gay ministries and conversion therapy as American. And yes, they did start here with Love in Action, the first modern ex-gay ministry in 1973. However, unfortunately, ex-gay ministries are one of our shameful exports. This is something that has damaged people in every corner of the world. And it is something that is a global fight. It's no longer just an American battle.
The most heartbreaking chapter in your book talks about how ex-gay American groups went to Uganda, which resulted in the notorious Kill the Gays law.
In Lies with a Straight Face, I talk about Christian colonialists. Ambitious ex-gay activists were trying to spread their message overseas. Unfortunately, they didn't do any research on the cultures of some countries that were virulently homophobic. One such case is Uganda, when ex-gay leaders went over to Kampala and spread the most despicable lies and stereotypes about LGBTQ people. For example, they're after your children, is what they said. And the result is they caused a moral panic in Uganda, which led to the Kill the Gays bill, as it's called. And that has passed today. And because of ex-gay leaders, in part, LGBTQ people live in fear and terror in Uganda. It's a disgrace, and it is one of the most shameful chapters in ex-gay history.
In Lies with a Straight Face, you say that the ex-gay industry is trying to rebrand and reboot. Why won't they learn from their failures?
As long as LGBTQ people are made to feel inferior, as long as they are made to feel that they are less than, as long as there is discrimination, ex-gay ministries and conversion therapy in some form will exist. That is why, in spite of all of their follies and failures, all of the exposés that have shown it doesn't work, it still persists and continues. Also, there's a lot of money to be made by these conversion therapists charging to change somebody. Because they don't get any results, people come session after session, month after month, year after year, with nothing but hope and their credit card. And these ex-gay therapists are avaricious. They are greedy. And they cash these checks. They put these credit cards through. And when the so-called cure inevitably fails, I have never seen an ex-gay minister or a conversion therapist refund the money from the people they've ripped off.
One relatively new ex-gay group is Freedom March. They made a big splash but have recently had a major setback.
One of the organizations trying to reboot and rebrand the ex-gay industry was Freedom March. They held these very media-friendly, boisterous rallies in Washington, D.C. and other cities across the United States. They were gaining traction and media attention until their founder came out as transgender and she announced that she wanted to identify as Scarlett, not Jeffrey McCall. It was very embarrassing for them because they had risen on the scene and made a big to-do about how they are new and how they're offering something different. But they didn't offer something different, and it was the same failed result as before.
Another character that appears in your book is conversion therapist Christopher Doyle. You reference Doyle's tendency to engage in false advertising.
Christopher Doyle is the #1 ex-gay leader in the United States right now. He runs the Institute for Healthy Families. I got a tip from someone that he wasn't exactly the family man that he was pretending to be. He had gone through a terrible divorce that he had hidden. And I went to Virginia to investigate the court records. And I thought I'd find a few skeletons. Instead, what I found was a graveyard. He was accused by his ex-wife of beating not only her, but attacking his mother-in-law. And he was arrested for this and taken to jail. And he was given 2 restraining orders, one in Florida and one in Virginia. That's not all. He threw a mixing bowl at his wife's head while she was pregnant. And he actually told her that he was sleeping with a prostitute. Some family guy this is. I mean, talk about hypocrites. Another accusation was that he grabbed 2 of his children by the neck and choked them. And he wouldn't take his hands off them until the mother came by and slowly ripped his hand off their throats. And the most interesting part were these text messages that were in the court exhibits, where he was communicating with an assistant of his who was also a former client. And they were calling each other these lovey-dovey names. I can't prove that they were having sex. I can't prove that they were in a relationship, but that sounds a little peculiar. It's not like any client-therapist relationship I'm aware of. Here is someone trying to cure people of their homosexuality, and yet he is hitting on a staff member of his and a former client. Here is somebody who has held up the heterosexual family as something that gay people should aspire to, when in fact he defiled the institution of marriage. Christopher Doyle is someone who should be getting therapy, not giving it.
What are ways that we can fight back against a resurgent ex-gay industry?
There are many ways we can fight back against a resurgent ex-gay industry. We have to continue to monitor these groups. We have to write about them. We have to expose their leaders as frauds. And we have to get the history out there, so people know these groups aren't new. They're not offering something innovative or unique. They are simply retreads. They are vestiges of the past. They are basically pigs with lipstick, trying to present themselves as pretty, when in fact, what they offer is ugly. It is old. It is tired. It is something that didn't work in the past and will not work in the future.
Do you believe that ex-gay groups will ever be as strong as they were in 1998, when the religious right launched the Truth in Love campaign?
Ex-gay groups will never be as strong as they were in 1998, when the religious right launched the Truth in Love campaign. Too much has happened. Too many of them have failed. We have seen over and over again those who said they had changed later said they had not, or they were caught in scandals. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. And they can try to rebrand, and they can try to reboot, and they can try to put lipstick on this pig, but the truth is already out there. And with a quick Google search, you can find their sordid history of folly and failure, of disasters and pain that they've quite frankly caused our community. And because that information's out there, people will have more information when they enter these groups, or they may choose not to go at all because they can see the truth.
In the final chapter, you interview a person who is accepted and was never in the closet. What point were you trying to make?
In the final chapter, I mention a person who never really had to come out of the closet. They just went into their sexual orientation without a big announcement, without the pain and suffering, without having to go to a program. It was normal and natural. And I mention that because that's the way it should be. We shouldn't have to run through these obstacles of idiocy. We shouldn't have to try to change. We should focus on being who we are, not who others want us to be. That is the goal. And that is what we are striving for.
You end the book with an interesting editorial choice. You quote the lyrics from the Talking Heads song Once in a Lifetime. Talk about the meaning behind this choice.
I entered the book with lyrics from the Talking Heads and the song Once in a Lifetime because they really resonated with me. And particularly the line, "My God, what have I done?" Because that's what people say who have been through these groups. They waste years of their lives, sometimes decades, that they'll never get back. And they're sad, they're depressed. They realize you'll never get back that lost time. And the other lyric from that song I mentioned was "Same as it ever was." Same as it ever was. And why that meant something to me was because after people go through these groups and read all the books and listen to the tapes and go to these boot camps, after all of that work, all of that effort, all of that money, all of the tears and pain, it's the same as it was the day they entered these programs. They haven't changed at all. And they're back in the same point that they started. Now, ex-gay groups, conversion therapists, they like to call it a journey, but it's really a dead end. It's really people running around on a stationary bike in a cul-de-sac. It's a dead end leading nowhere. And so they say it's the same as it ever was on the last day as it was on the first day. Help us fight ex-gay lies. Truth Wins Out monitors, researches, and exposes the ex-gay conversion industry. Support us and learn more at truthwinsout.org.